G'day friends and fans, welcome to Dave Talk Stuff Ukraine War Update for the 6th of August 2025. I'm your host, the author David Applegate, author of the books The Boyhood Arcade, Power Games, Into the Elsmound, and The Erotic Tales from the Empire, Part 1 available now. All my links are in the link tree. Thank you to all those who support the channel. You can support the channel by joining my Patreon, buying my books, or buying my merch. Thank you to all those who support the channel. Now the war continues, and yeah, there's a whole. Might as well open it. All right, so this is yesterday. This is occurring right now. Trump's envoy meeting with Vladimir Putin to talk about ending the Ukraine war. The BBC putting out speculation because they know as much about Ukraine as the average person. And they're supposed to be they're a brainwashing corporation. They think Keir Starmer is a good person. Same with The Guardian. The Guardian, we hate the Iraq war. Well, but all the way with LBJ in Iraq, right? I mean, all the way with Biden in Iraq, wasn't it? Until Biden turned against the war. And it's like, but it was your war, Biden. And it's the same with Ukraine. They're going to turn against Ukraine the moment they can pin it on the Republicans. Because this is Obama's war. And they want to protect their boy's legacy. The media are fapping off to Ukraine, of course, But in reality, look at that. We finally have admission that Russia attacks a military target. Because you think they use trains for civilian transport? Well, of course, fighting continues in many areas. And as you can see, there's progress. A Ukrainian drone attacked a water utility. That's civilian water supply. That's a war crime. Okay? That's deliberately targeting civilian facilities. Oh, yeah, I told you India was involved, but so what? Ukraine, you're hypocrites. You get military aid from around the world. Well, there's no law that says Russia can't do the same. The world is full of hypocrites, though. You cry harder, Ukraine. Cry harder. The world is dividing itself over Ukraine, and quite frankly, the world should be saying, we both hate you. We both should kick you to the curb. But no, virtue signalling goes on, putting money in the pockets of the war profiteers. But Zelensky is saying that he had a productive conversation with Donald Trump. Really? I don't think so. Okay? Okay, Trump could probably bring an end to this war. I'm not saying that he can't. But I'm saying the biggest obstacle is Zelensky. Because he won't stop until he gets his way. And you might say, but if it was your country... But if it was my country, we wouldn't have a coup. And we wouldn't be fighting our fellow countrymen. Unless, of course, they were terrorists. But this is not the case. Ukraine is fighting to either drive out or murder the ethnic Russians because they want to take their land and the resources so they can have it for themselves. But so many people are arrogant and ignorant, they don't want to really look into the Donbass war because then it would expose the fact that the media for the last 10 or something years has covered up the fact that Ukraine has been at war with itself. And until the Russian invasion, Ukraine had a Nazi problem. And then all of a sudden, the media pretends there isn't. Now, looks definitely like Russia's opening up you can't say a second front, another front, that they're expanding what they call the buffer zone. And they threatened this, saying that if Ukraine didn't come to the peace talks in Turkey, that Russia would consider all options. So they are expanding and adding more buffer zones. This at some point probably expanded because of... But it doesn't show any fighting, so... But there's fighting here and expansion. But there are definite areas where Russia is stalled. And this is one of them, this little cauldron in here. Now, definitely, there's reports of progress in the Lyman area, but we don't see it marked on the map. We see fighting here, again, with no results, but it's been like that for months. Pretty much fighting on the outskirts of Chavez Yar continues. Again, it's been off and on for months with no real progress, but while the troops are bogged down in Chavez Yar, Russia has and moved up on other targets. Now, they haven't sealed the deal down here, but they have some progress along here. Little bit of progress here, not much. But here is stalled. Now, you're not going to get progress every day, of course, in every battlefield or every front. In fact, this is settling in. Now, of course, it's slow loading for some reason today. Despite the fact I've loaded these maps multiple times, it's just not caching the maps. It's reloading them every time. And it's annoying. Sometimes even when I zoom, it decides it's going to reload a map. All right, so lots of action without progress, and that's why. Bloody ads, right? But the Yankees need all the money they can get. No, they don't. They need all the brain cells they can get. Now, clearly this is the target, okay? This rail junction, this is key. We zoom back. All right. They want to, see. This brings in everything into Pavlovsk, okay? But as now it's under threat, but see, all of this was designed for combat from west to east, not east to west. And Russia is coming up through the weak point here to bring all this under artillery. Clearly, the volume of Ukrainian troops in here is sufficient to cause a slowdown from Pavlovsk all the way through. As I said, there's been a silent build-up in both this line, and this line. Now, I think somewhere along the line, there has probably been a build-up through here. Don't forget, military movements and numbers are rarely reported, so you're going to miss a lot. Now, clearly, Russia is I would think that this is defending their flanks, then it appears they're not going to cross this line. They're only... But again, it goes against what they said about the buffer zone. So, particularly when they've crossed the line here. But this is different. This is... so, whether they continue up this line in a more geographically suitable, but if they were, they would have crossed this through here as well. But Ukraine does have the high ground, and technically you'd want to go around and come from behind. So that's a possibility, which means they've got to secure this road and destroy this. If it's so, here, continued advances, taken this town. The map isn't keeping up with the Russian advance, although it's not far and fast. And, of course, in many areas, it is stalled simply because the size of the Russian army is insufficient. But, of course, Ukraine keeps claiming they're all about peace and complaining about Russian attacks, and then they attack Russia, which then Russia attacks Ukraine hours later. But Russia's somehow the aggressor. That makes sense, does it? But you've got to report the facts, even when they go against. This is why I don't like politics, because most people are political, which means they're biased, which means they deliberately ignore facts. And when you choose fiction, which is politics is a fiction, right? It's selling a narrative. So, Russian troops have taken Yanovsky in the DPR. 205 casualties and destroyed a combat vehicle. Now, if it was that lightly defended, I would think after months of no progress, I would say Ukraine retreated and left behind the territorial guard. Now, that would either indicate that they are insufficient in their recruitment, or they're losing far more than they let on, and that the main army is abandoning the territorial guard to preserve itself. If that were the case, however, why didn't they take up on previous American offers? And I'm not sure if this was... but instead of fighting here, they should have had a continuous bulwark all the way. One big bulwark. Right. A tighter line of defense instead of investing in fragmented thick lines of defense, allegedly spending billions of dollars, and to do what? Watch it go up in smoke, see the precious lives wasted, all because they get the thrill of sitting in their bunkers, or the people in Europe clutching their pearls going, "Oh, dead Russians, I can feel safe now." The left and their delusions are fueling this war. And it's not just Russia paying the price. Of course, the ones who are ultimately paying the price are the hundreds of casualties in every town that amass to thousands. Remember, up to 70% of the casualties on the Ukraine side will die. Now, I say up to because it's not a set amount every day. It's not some arbitrary thing that happens every day. Some days they save more lives than others. But leaks were coming out in 23, and it could be less now, but there hasn't been much to... but there were leaks in 23 that Ukraine was losing 70% of its wounded, whereas Russia was only losing 30%. Remember, when they say wounded, they mean everybody shot, okay? Even if that bullet killed you straight away, you were still wounded, and you're counted as wounded until you're confirmed dead, and then they move you to the deceased column. So you start with a lot of wounded, and then they say X% died because they have to deal with numbers in a way that don't drive the average person insane. If you were going, and the average person, and rightfully so, would automatically start to feel horrid about the casualties, which is why they're so precious with the casualties in Ukraine, because they don't want to repeat the Vietnam War, where America didn't lose the Vietnam War. America gave up on the Vietnam War because they had a hissy fit over the casualties, even though the casualties they were inflicting were much higher, and the enemy was expecting a counterpush which could have wiped them out. But they didn't, because Nixon was horrified at the casualties. And of course then the CIA were lying about the casualties. The CIA were actually in a position to have taken out the Viet Cong leadership, and they didn't. There's a whole lot of things there. And we're going to find out stuff about Ukraine too, but we're not going to see a lot of true-to-life heroism out of Ukraine. Of course, the Russian side, they're going to have their propaganda films. Everybody's going to do it. But ultimately, this is like that forgotten movie, The 300 Days of War. And people forget that Russia and Ukraine had a war before, and Ukraine lost. And they don't want to repeat. Their ego. That's why they attacked. Now, I'm not saying Ukraine attacked Russia. I'm saying Ukraine provoked Russia with its attack on Donetsk, on ethnic Russians. And whether you like it or not, a rogue operative, probably Ukrainian, because if it was a Russian, trust me, if it was a Russian, okay, it would have all been exposed. Why is the shooting down of the Dutch airliner covered up and raced through secret trials? Because it was a Ukrainian out of the Azov battalion. It was a Ukrainian SA-6, not a Russian SA-28. People are lying all the time about Ukraine. Why? Because they want to cozy up to Ukraine, put their arm around them and say, give us your resources. Now, Trump has managed to pull that off, sort of. Ukraine is still in a position, as many commentators say, to back out of this deal or to run out the clock on Trump's presidency and tear up the agreement with the next president, especially if it's a Democrat, just by going, woohoo, it's unfair. Typical Ukraine, take the money and run. Now, everybody, not just the US president, is, and I'm not going to pass moral judgment, but there's a lot of world leaders who are upset with Russia. And there are a lot of Russia's trading partners, right, who are playing both sides of the war. As I said, India sold ammunition to both sides. India sold electronics to everybody. India has sold fuel and fertilizer. And you know, Ukraine has been using fertilizer bombs in their drones. You see so has Russia, by the way, those orange explosions, those high flash orange explosions, or those brightly burned yellowish, that's ammonia. They're carbon, they're fuel fires, basically. Okay, you get your ammonia and your nitrates and your high pressure liquefied gas. Now, to say that Ukraine is a mess on both sides and for both leaders, Trump is trying to untangle this mess, and of course the Europeans are in the way, trying to trip Trump over so they can go, ha ha! Trust me, in world politics this happens all the time. This is nothing new. It's not just Trump derangement syndrome. It happens all the time anyway, just because somebody wants to remind you, cut us in for a deal and we won't stop up and we'll get out of your way, sort of thing, blackmail. When you hear about 60 million-year-old men sent to the front, it's not exaggeration. Ukraine has, in the past, sent old men to fight. This is how they... But also, they have 3 armies. Okay. Don't forget, they have 3 lines throughout here, right? Well, 2 and a bit. One's partially all but crumbled. Like the last remnants of the first line is in here. But this is your second line. And this is your third line. And you have another... and these are basically... This is the bulk of the Ukrainian army. Then you've got your territorial guards to the north and the south. But you also have your territorial guards along the front lines. Okay? They're backed and back up the Ukrainian army. That's why you get their mechanized units, your light infantry with some machinery. Then you get the Ukrainian army is the tank units. And then you've got the Ukrainian Special Forces and the Air Force, which are actually mainly drone pilots, right? Well, what are you going to do with the Ukraine Air Force? They're down to 127 jets, which is still a lot, and would explain why some days they can shoot down 100 drones, but they can't shoot down missiles. I think that might actually... Is that new? Oh, it's old. Yeah, I thought so. I was expecting a missile strike today, and there isn't much to report, though there is a few. But so Russia's changing its pattern. I'm not surprised. They get Ukraine used to a pattern, and that's why they were able to hit a train, because Ukraine said, "Oh, they've hit us. We'll move the train now," and suddenly, boom, the train gets hit. Why? Because Russia was expecting that. But I'm not surprised that Trump has acknowledged, and so has Russia, that everybody has the right to choose their trade partners. But what I'm also saying is that Trump has the right to say, well, if you're trading with Russia, I'm going to tariff you. It's the president's right. And you know what? I don't think legally he has to give you an excuse. I think he has to give notice, and there's certain procedures in place. But this whole thing that we defy the US, right? That's typical ego. Like, look at us, we strong. Ugh. When reality is, they're all a bunch of backstabbers, lies, and thieves, okay? They're not... When you supporting Xi Jinping, and Lula, who was put in power by Biden, is sucking up to Xi Jinping. Obama and Clinton put Zuma and remember Clinton and South Africa, look at how that's turned out. And Modi in India, he was supposed to be America's next best friend. Ha! They're all liars and thieves. And they blast America's hypocrisy. I blast America's hypocrisy. But there's no such thing as trade fairness when you're supporting the world's biggest slave state. Or what, Lula, who's stolen from Brazil pretty much over a... No, I don't think he's personally stolen. I think he's allowed government workers to steal hundreds of millions of dollars in this phony, which was exposed, this phony reforestation deal, which was turned out to be a money laundering scheme to subsidise timber cutters. They buy off natives to stay silent about their... that after the timber cutters have finished destroying their forests, that the natives can move in and farm the land. But the problem is, all this farmland, turns out, forests don't make good farmland. Okay, the soil requirements for crops is way higher than that of a forest, by the way. Because remember, a farm is concentrated. It doesn't have meters between trees. It has, and of course it needs high irrigation, and you've just changed the climate. You have changed the climate, by the way. When you cut down a forest, the climate does change. It gets less rainfall. There's something about trees that contribute to rainfall, as well as large bodies of water. Now, India has claimed that they have no interest in and will not buckle to pressure. Obviously, when you're talking about 2.2 million barrels, yeah. India is probably, as I said, look at it. Trade deal, they're BRICS. But so what? Okay. So what if Brazil's got coffee? You're not the only coffee producer, Brazil. I think Lula is underestimated. I think none of these people are smart enough on their own. But collectively, you think they'd be smart enough to realise Xi Jinping is their problem, because he's backstabbing them all. Xi Jinping wants to make sure that all of these states are his little muppets. And what you're looking at is a group of people who suck up to power. And Xi Jinping, well, he only has power because foreign companies were in no position to bargain. They had no choice. If American companies didn't go to China, other companies would. This is a nest of vipers, and this is what geopolitics really is. Okay? And if you want to know the truth about geopolitics, okay, it was invented by the Nazis. It's what they did is they rated every country on favorability lists, on value of trade, on various political groups and ethnic groups. And they valued these companies they valued these countries as companies, individually and collectively within them. And they were able to effectively divide and conquer Europe within a matter of months compared to all the previous attempts, which, remember, Italy. Now, really, German geopolitics was based on the way back on the Roman, but I'm still saying Germany was able to effectively do in months what previous empires tried and took centuries. And that is figuring out what somebody values the most and how you can leverage that into swaying the entire population to your side. Which is why, and is so critical to not have media ownership in the hands of the few. You have to have multiple media voices. and multiple sources of media in your life, and you have to have conflicting points of view in your life. Otherwise, you become, and you may not realize this, indoctrinated. Okay? It's the reason why television is called programming. Yes, it was created by the Nazis. Yes, it was all this geopolitical and psychological manipulation. And you just have to look up Operation MK Artichoke. How did America know that Germany was working on and successful at brainwashing large groups and manipulating large groups of people? Because they hired the people who were doing it. I'm sorry, they hired Argentinians and Brazilians. And George just happened to have German last names, right? But so did the Russians, so did the French, and so did the British. Okay? The whole point of World War II was a big carve-up. All right? You go back to 1936, the Tehran agreements plural, how Roosevelt and Stalin were in constant communication. Roosevelt's secretary was outed as a Soviet spy of influence. That Jacob Schiff, Adam Schiff's grandfather, was a war profiteer who, on behalf of American arm manufacturers, had talked, no, not just American, but others, had talked pretty much Japan into the war with China, which involved at the time Russia, I think, and America, and that Wilson had abandoned their ally Japan, and Japan was increasingly under attacks from bandits who later became communists, and instead of helping their Japanese ally, they started selling arms to China. And then they abandoned their ally Chiang Kai-shek because they wanted to appease Stalin in and thinking that appeasing Stalin would basically get concessions from the Russians in Germany. Didn't work. Stalin went ahead with the Berlin Wall anyway, but they later did at least get some concessions on the Berlin airlift. But this they got the Berlin corridor. But these geopolitical losses in the past fueled and carried hatred in people like Brennan, who have often said they want revenge on Russia for what they did in the past. Bro, your job is not revenge, it's security. And getting revenge creates insecurity. And Ukraine wants revenge, which is creating insecurity. If you look at the facts of the Russian Revolution and the revolutions before that, they were Jews out of Ukraine who were the leadership of the Bolsheviks. So if you want revenge on communism, look inward to Zelensky and his cohorts. But I do not subscribe to the view that Zelensky is responsible for his grandfather's being a two-faced rat. Okay? He has no control over that. He's responsible for his actions today. And yes, Zelensky is a two-faced rat. But he shouldn't be held responsible for his grandfather's crimes. Only his own. So thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, and please support the channel. You can support the channel on Patreon, buy my books, buy my merch. And if you think that winning at all costs, and that's the only thing that matters, well, you might just be wearing a black and red armband one day and saying the ends justify the means, because that's exactly how the far left radicals think, that the ends always justify the means as long as they win. But as soon as they start losing, they cry like little bitches. But Russia ain't the Soviet Union. And sooner or later, we may be fighting a war on Russian soil against the Red Army. Because let's face the truth. The biggest threat to global security is an increasingly unstable and erratic Xi Jinping who wants to maintain and preserve Chinese communism. And in order to preserve communism, he needs to prop up his economy. And the only way he's going to get the resources he needs is to invade Russia. Just like back in 1979, China invaded Vietnam. And why anybody would trust China ever again is beyond me. But then again, it could be because they really do not believe in the sins of the grandfather. And that's fair enough. That could be it. But Xi Jinping has moved troops time and time again. And people have said China's been on the verge of invading Taiwan 3 times. I'm watching that and unfold. And each time China goes to make a move, something happens to one of their precious warships. Last time I heard, they had to tow a former Russian submarine back to China for repairs, and that they lost a propeller on one of their aircraft carriers. They got cracks in the hull of another one. They got failures of the third one to launch aircraft, and the fourth one is a year behind, at least on schedule, and it may actually be bent and scrapped, or they're trying to. There's a margin of error when you make a ship, and the ship might actually be outside the margin of error and not have a straight keel, which would cause the ship to have a certain bias as it goes through the water, meaning they constantly have to correct course more often than they need. So things are unfolding around the rest of the world, and trust me, Ukraine is a distraction, but I'll keep bringing the news for as long as I can. Anyway, please support the channel. Scan the QR code on the screen. Bye for now.